Hey everybody, Tim Albrick here, and thank you for listening to the YFP podcast, where each week we strive to inspire and encourage you on your path towards achieving financial freedom. This week, Tim Baker and I revisit saving for kids' college, a topic that is top of mind for both of us in our own financial plans. Before we answer the question, how much is enough when it comes to saving for kids' college, we discuss the priority for investing, including where kids' college savings fits among other goals, and the differences between common vehicles that are used for saving for kids' college. Let's hear a message from today's sponsor, First Horizon, and then we'll jump into our discussion of how much is enough when it comes to saving for kids' college. Does saving 20% for a down payment on a home feel like an uphill battle? It's no secret that pharmacists have a lot of competing financial priorities, including high student loan debt, meaning that saving 20% for a down payment on a home may take years. For several years now, we've been partnering with First Horizon, who offers a professional home loan option, aka a doctor or pharmacist loan, that requires a 3% down payment for a single-family home or townhome for first-time home buyers, has no PMI, and offers a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage on home loans up to $766,550 in most areas. The pharmacist home loan is available in all states except Alaska and Hawaii and can be used to purchase condos as well. However, rates may be higher and a condo review has to be completed. While I've personally worked with First Horizon before and had a great experience with Tony and his team, don't just take it from me. Here's what Emily from Prattville, Alabama had to say about her experience with First Horizon. Clear communication and excellent guidance from Gail and Cindy throughout the entire process. I greatly appreciated the fact that everything was digital because I'm allergic to paper. The ability to upload inside everything digitally made the process very efficient, which I prefer. This was by far the best mortgage process I have experienced. This is my 7th when counting refinances. So to check out the requirements for First Horizon's pharmacist home loan and to start the pre-approval process, visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home-loan. Again, that's yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home-loan. Tim, it's good to have you back on the show.
Good to be back, Tim. How's it going?
It is going well. This is going to be a fun one. We're discussing a topic that is top of mind for both of us in our own financial plans. I've got 4 kids, 12 and under. You've got 3 kids, 9 and under. And we're in that prime window where saving for kids' college it's getting real, right? We look at our older children and say, hey, that's not too far off. And it really begs the question, are we on track? And I don't know about you, but for me, it feels like early on when the boys were much younger, it was this concept of, hey, let's start putting money away and we'll worry about that later. Worrying about that later is right now.
Yeah, life comes at you fast, right, Tim? So, a lot of people, they might say, "Hey, I'll get to that," or I talk to prospective clients all the time, and it's like, "Yeah, I really want to put money away for my kids' college, and I've been thinking about it for a while." And I'm like, "Well, how old your son or daughter?" And it's like, "Oh, they're 8." So how long have you been thinking about this? For 8 years. So it is one of those things, and that sometimes that's true. That holds true for retirement too, Tim. So it's one of those things where the sooner you the sooner you do it, the better. It makes the amount that you are, what you're trying to do easier to kind of achieve. So, we're right in the thick of it, and hoping that the cost of college doesn't continue to kind of inflate at what it has in the past, but no control over that, obviously.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that specifically because when we get to the part of trying to determine how much is enough, we got to make some assumptions on what is going to be the cost of college into the future. Now, for those that are listening that have kids that are butting up against college, we know what those numbers are going to be or likely be. But for those that have kids that are much, much younger, trying to project out 15, 16, 17 years, what college costs may look like can certainly be more challenging. Tim, I want to get your perspective on what seems to be a varying philosophy around saving for kids' college. I recently published a poll on LinkedIn asking individuals, how are you approaching saving for kids' college? And there was over 260 people that responded. And here were the results. 30% said that they plan to fully fund their kids' college. 61% said they plan to partially fund. And just shy of 10% said, you know what, they're on their own. Kids got to figure it out on their own. So when you hear that and interactions you've had with clients, anything surprise you there?
I am surprised. I am a little surprised. I feel like the 60%, the partial would have been a lot more.
Yeah.
Like that would have been closer to like 80, and then maybe like 10 and 10 on, they're on their own, or I'm going to do 100%. So that's probably the only thing. Cause I talk to, clients all the time, and it's those three things. It's like, hey, I went through this, so my kid has to go through it. I went through this. I never want my kid to go through it. And then that in between of like,
Mm-hmm.
I want to provide something, but I just don't know what that is. So little surprised by the percentages, honestly. How big of a sample size was that?
Over 260 people, so pretty large group.
Okay, that's not
Yeah, that
yeah.
responded, and there was a couple comments that I think really, drive home some of the differing opinions. And everyone obviously is on their own journey. One person said, "quote They want to partially fund. They referring to their kids. They need to have skin in the game. I've also heard of parents giving their kids cash directly for any scholarships they get. That's a neat way of incentivizing working hard for them." Someone else said, "Hey, would love to fully fund, but also need to look at my future in retirement." And we'll talk about that here in a little bit as it relates to the priority of investing and how we want to think about kids' college among other competing financial goals. So, we're going to break today's discussion into three parts. Part one is going to be just that. We'll talk about the priority of investing. Where might kids' college fit into the broader part of the financial plan? Certainly, this is not investing advice, but some considerations there. Part two, we'll talk about the common vehicles, and we'll spend the most time on the 529 plan. And then part three, we'll really spend time answering the question, how much is enough? And I'm excited about that part because this is a piece that we haven't drilled down into the details as much as the other two. And for reference, we'll link to these in the show notes. But we have talked about kids' college previously on the podcast. Episode 195, we talked about how to save for your child's education. In episode 211, we talked about the ins and outs of the 529 college savings plan. So again, we'll link to those. Make sure to check those out for more information. Tim, let's start with that first part, which is the priority of investing. And I want to go back to the comment that you made that, for some people, especially when they came out with six figures or more of debt, I'm thinking about my own journey of a couple $100,000 of debt. There can be a reaction of, hey, I never want my child to have to go through that either at all or something along those lines. And therefore, I'm going to start shoveling money into kids' college savings accounts as early as possible and not necessarily think about, where that might lie in context with my own retirement savings or emergency funds or other parts of the financial goal. So it begs this question of, where does kids' college savings fit as a priority as we think about other investment vehicles or options? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, I've had these conversations where people are like, I really want to get started and, save for Johnny's education or whatever, but, we're looking at $25,000 in credit card debt, right? So,
Yeah.
not something that should be a high priority. We have to get through the consumer debt. So obviously, like if we talk about the baby steps, we want to make sure the consumer debt's in check, Tim. We want to make sure that we have a proper emergency fund. Still, a lot of people don't, come to the table with that. And that's something that we have to work on. And what is a proper emergency fund? Where should we put it? It's not an investment. Those at a baseline, I think, are the big things I would be looking at. And I think beyond that, I think what most people would agree is shift into retirement and looking at what that looks like. Do we have a match? At least get the match. And then I think based on that, and again, I would be doing a retirement projection, a nest egg projection. I'd want to make sure that like some of the wealth protection stuff is shoring up. So like, do you have the proper life insurance, disability? Do we have the state plan documents in place? All that kind of stuff to then get back into the conversation of, okay, what's the next step after this? So, a lot of people, again, and the analogy that I like to use is like when you're on the plane and, they say, hey, if we lose cabin pressure and the mask come from, that's a really crappy situation. That's not going to be fun, but put your mask on first, right? Put your mask on first before you handle your kids. So that's going to be the same when we're talking about retirement and an education plan. So your retirement should come before your children's college tuition. There's no financial aid in retirement, and there's still a good amount of that, for your kids' school. We might get to a point, Tim, where you're not going to see the money flow as much for college loans and financial aid and things like that. That could be a real thing, reckoning that's happening. However, I think there'll always be alternatives whether that's, community college or trade schools, or things that you can do that, or at least get started. So that to me is the big thing. I think when you get into the nuance of retirement, the question I would ask to that person, that client, is like, are we on track for retirement?
Mm-hmm.
And if we are, obviously, like, let the money flow from an education perspective. If we're not, that's where I would want to,
Mm-hmm.
and I think what a lot of people too, Tim, what they do is, it's not even really a question about what bucket they should fill. Part of what drives this is the tax benefits related to something like a 529.
Yep.
So in Ohio, you can get up to $4,000 per student, regardless of filing status, per year off of your Ohio state income tax. So a lot of people see that and be like, boom, that's what I'm going to do.
Mm-hmm.
Or I want to get a portion of that, without kind of doing the ABCs of where that should go. So I think outside of the match, I would say get the match. But then there's probably a little bit more nuance in terms of like, okay, how do we then go from here in terms of, are we putting more into the retirement, or we putting more, or are we starting to kind of, flow monies into education planning?
Yeah, and Tim, what you're sharing right there to me is such a good example of the benefit, one of the benefits of comprehensive financial planning. Because at the end of the day, we only have so much income to work with. Hopefully, we can increase that income. We can only cut our expenses so much, and we've got a certain amount of cash flow that we're going to be able to assign to different financial goals. Right, that could be building up an emergency fund. That could be paying down debt. That could be a real estate purchase. That could be put money in a 529. That could be retirement savings for the future. And so we're left with this decision of, hey, I've got all these balls potentially to juggle in the air. How am I going to do that, and in what order? And second to it depends, probably the most common thing that we say on this podcast is, you can't make decisions in a silo when it comes to the financial plan. We've got to be able to take a step back and look at all the different factors so that we can see, oh, okay, well, if I pull this lever, then what's the impact of this part of the plan, right? Because by pulling
That's
that
right.
lever, putting money in a 529, that means we're not probably doing something else. And are we okay with that? Are we not okay with that? And if we project that out, what does that mean for us in terms of achieving our financial goals? The other thing I would mention, and I know this episode is not focused on what we think is the future of higher ed, but because I spent over a decade in that space, I feel the need to comment. Like, when you talk about something like the contraction potentially of access to financial aid and student loans, man, you've got to believe that if that were to happen in the future, there would be a significant shift in the business model of higher education at large, right? It's already on the brink, I would say, of some level of disruption, if that's not already happening. And if there's less resource going into the system, what does that mean in terms of what the actual infrastructure looks like, the degree offerings, the supply and demand? So I think that is a relevant comment, because one of the lingering questions behind all of this, especially for those that have very, very young kids, is, what will this model look like in 15 to 20 years? What will the cost be? And that we need to know, or at least project out to some level to be able to do some assumptions.
Yeah, and sometimes with uncertainty, Tim, like, we can do one of two things. It's like, well, I have, and people do this with retirement. It's like, I don't really even know. So then maybe they oversave, or perhaps they just kind of throw their hands up in the air and like, okay, whatever I have, I have.
Yeah.
So, it is a little bit, the further we go in the future, the more uncertainty we have. Again, we can make some educated guesses and conjecture. But again, it goes back to the whole idea of, you want to, it's more about planning than the plan, because life happens, things change. And the reason I'm kind of, distracted is, like, I'm looking at my numbers, Tim, and we'll go through this later, but like the numbers for like Olivia's 4-year, like, they went up from the last time I talked about it. So I'm like, oh, I got to update these numbers because they're a little bit out of date. And what that means is like, when I looked at these last month, the inflation numbers associated with education were higher than what they were a month ago.
Yep.
So the tool that I'm using was updated. So I've kind of updated my calculator to kind of back into that. So, like, it's planning. Now, again, like for Olivia, who's going to turn 10 this year, I still have 8 years to kind of, plan and figure this out, which makes it easier. The closer we get, obviously, when she's 16, we'll have a little bit more of a picture of what education looks like, but a whole lot less time to kind of change and plan for that. So, yeah.
So let's shift gears and talk about the common vehicles. Again, we've covered this a little bit on previous episodes that we'll link to in the show notes, but there are various options out there, right? When it comes for saving for kids' college, everything from 529 plans, which we'll spend the majority of our time on, to the Coverdale education savings accounts, UGMAs, UPMAs, Roth IRAs. Heck, you could just open a brokerage account and save that way if people want to do that. But there's clearly some pros and cons to these accounts, and perhaps why the 529 has risen to the top for many as, I guess if we could pick the most popular among this group. So tell us at a high level about those common vehicles that are out there, and then we can get into the 529 more specifically.
Yeah, so the Coverdales and the UPMAs and UGMAs are very similar. These are just custodial accounts that are like brokerage accounts, but they have the minor's name on there. So the reason the Coverdales aren't as popular anymore is because the amount of money that you could put in per year is like $2,000 or $3,000. I might have seen one Coverdale account in my career in financial planning. So I don't see them very, very often. The UGMAs and UPMAs I see more often, and I actually have one for all three of my kids and then all of my nieces and nephews. It's kind of my nephew Timmy just turned 10 yesterday. So I put money into his, he lives out in Oregon, so I don't see him as much. I don't really know what he's into from a gift perspective. So I just put some cash into that. And the big thing for that is like, I'm managing the account. I'm the guardian on the account. Once they reach the age of majority, so in certain states that might be 18, in other states that might be 19 or 21, that money is theirs, right? So that for me is going to be a gift when all of my nieces and nephews and my kids turn that they can use. Now they could use that for school, but they could also use that for something else, right? There's not the strings attached like a 529 has, where you have to use it for qualified education expenses. So with my daughter, I've talked about, it could be for school. It could be, she's talking about a gap year. I'm like, how do you even know what a gap year is? You're 9. It could be to start a business, whatever that is. So, and that for me is a little bit more of an in your face vehicle for me to talk more about money on a long-term basis. Like right now we have allowance and we have a save, spend, and gift. This is kind of the next thing. So that is a powerful tool, but not necessarily just, for the purpose of education. Now, the big thing with that is like when they go to spend that money, capital gains tax is going to be a big part of that. So you have to, and that's the same thing with, like a brokerage account if you're just managing that for your kids, but their kids' name isn't on there. The other one that a lot of people will use is the Roth IRA, because you can take out the basis, tax-free, penalty-free. So you could use a Roth IRA. Again, you could use your own Roth IRA. If your kid has like income, you could set up their own Roth IRA. So there's a little bit of nuance there in terms of how you use that. I know a lot of people will use a Roth IRA just because they don't like the restrictions of the 529 just being used for qualified education expenses. So that's something that people could use. I don't personally use that. Like, I feel very comfortable with the 529. I feel very comfortable that it'll continue to expand in terms of what you could use it for. So that really leaves a 529 in terms of a vehicle. So the 529, Tim, think of it as like a retirement account, except for education. So you can put after-tax dollars in there. It grows tax-free. You might get a state income tax deduction. Like I mentioned, you can get $4,000 per beneficiary per beneficiary in the state of Ohio. Every state's going to be different. Some states don't have anything. Some states have very generous. All 529s are not created equal. So like some of them are going to be really great. We were actually looking at the expenses the other day, and we were surprised that Ohio is a little bit higher than we thought. So you have to be cognizant of that. So you put the money in there, it grows tax-free. And then if it is used for qualified education expenses, which is typically tuition fees, books, supplies, equipment, room and board, computer or like peripheral equipment or software, internet, that can all be, part of that distribution. So just like in a retirement account, you are kind of saving for, 18 years or 10 years, depending on when you start. So you have that accumulation period. And then that accumulation period, typically in retirement, might be 10, 20, 30 years as until you die. Here, it's typically 4, 6, maybe 8 years, depending on what your goal is, from an undergrad to, master's, et cetera. So that's the big thing. You put the money in, you invest it. A lot of them have target date funds. A lot of them you can pick S&P 500. They grow that tax free. And again, just to kind of reiterate that is, when I buy XYZ ETF for my daughter in her UTMA account, we buy it at 100 shares or $100 per share. When when she's 18 and she's now cashing that out, maybe that portion of her investment is $400 per share, which is great, but we have to pay the $300 per share capital gains, and it's going to be long-term capital gains on that gain that we have. In the education account, that you don't have that. So that's one of the benefits along with the state. So the UTMA and the Coverdale and the brokerage account gives you more flexibility in terms of what you can use it on, but there's tax consequences. That's the string. And I feel comfortable, Tim, and we can talk about that a little bit more, that there are enough outs for me from a 529 to feel comfortable, put in a good amount of money into that to have for education expenses. And if Olivia doesn't need it, maybe my next kid or even grandkids.
Let's talk about that flexibility for a moment, because I do think that is probably the number one objection, right? And you mentioned the tax differences for those to choose save in a an UGMA, an UTMA, or another type of custodian brokerage account. So the way I think about the 529 is it's like a Roth for college, right? It's after tax dollars going in. It has the potential to grow or lose, right? Anytime we talk about investments, we can lose, but growth, hopefully long-term tax-free, and then we can pull it out and use it for qualified educational expenses, which there's been an expansion of over the last decade or so. And that's what I want to talk about with flexibility, because I agree with you. I think there's several things that maybe in the sense of 529s were more restrictive that they've expanded upon. So, right, you think about what is considered to be a qualified educational expense. That would be one area that comes to mind. The expansion several years ago to allow these to be used for K through 12 private education. That's a second one I think about. And then more recently would be the Roth conversion opportunities, which is a third one. So it feels like all signs are pointing in the direction of more flexibility, not less, when it comes to the 529s.
Yeah, and I think eventually one of the things that got kicked out was at the very last minute with the Secure Act 2.0 was like homeschooling. Like that's not you can't use funds for homeschooling. I do think that, again, like when I started advising people on 529s back in the day, like you couldn't use a $529 to buy like a laptop for college. Right. Like that was a restrictive thing, and they've improved upon that. Right now, like before, you couldn't pay if you had money in your 529, you couldn't take that money out and pay off a student loan without a penalty.
Yeah,
they changed that. Now it's still restrictive. Like I think it's a $10,000 maximum limit, which is silly in my opinion. Just use that. That's what it's for, is to kind of minimize education expenses, like pay off the loan. Yeah, to your point, the Roth was a big thing that they put in, and there's a lot of hoops you got to jump through. It has to be open for at least 15 years or longer before you can move those dollars from a 529 into a Roth.
Right.
The last 5 years worth of contributions are ineligible, right? So like if you put dollars in at 18, you have to wait until they're past 23 to move those dollars over. And the maximum lifetime transfer to a beneficiary is capped at $35,000, which again I also think is silly.
Yeah, might change. So, we'll see.
Yeah, and I think they will. I think they'll be, again, as I think it'll adapt it more as like if higher education looks a lot different. I think they'll adapt it. They've shown that they will be able to. And again, at the end of the day, for me, Tim, and again, not everyone's going to think this, but like if my kids don't need it, like I'm going to cascade that down to Liam, to Zoe, and if Zoe doesn't need it, I'll probably just let it ride for a grandkid or grandkids. So to me, like I'm okay with that. Like I don't need to go to like, every kid equally or even my kids. It can kind of go down a generation. Not everyone's okay with that. I had a couple last week, Tim, that we talked about education, hadn't started anything, and right off the rip, they're like, I don't want to do a 529. And I said, like, keep your mind open. And part of it is like the tax. Part of it is like, are you okay with everyone's like, oh, I don't know if my kids are going to college. They might be different. Which that's all like fair, right? So it's we're a lot of us are open these when they're a toddler. Who knows what they're going to grow up to be? But for me, I think, and again, I'm not looking at 100% solution, so I don't necessarily need hundreds of thousands of dollars, like, if I was doing 100% solution. So this is kind of, I look at this as kind of a coupon, for future spending from the aspect of college tuition.
Yeah. And I think too, the other scenario to consider is, when you talk about keeping options open, is like, what is the worst case scenario? It's a 10% penalty, right? When we look at non-qualified withdrawals. And the other thing I would add to the discussion, which by the way, nobody wants to pay a 10% penalty. So let's be clear, but I would add to the discussion that there has also been an expansion beyond what we think of the traditional 4-year degree, right? Trade schools, certificate programs, apprenticeships. So I think that's another example when we talk about flexibility. And I think, for a lot of people, it feels like in the circles of discussions we have with other families of age around our boys about higher education, it seems like the trades is coming up more and more as there's some clear demand in certain areas. So again, keep the options open. And as you begin to think about what this looks like for you and your family, certainly there are options out there. And if you do look at the 529, we've got a great resource on our blog, 7 things to consider before starting a 529 plan, or if you already have one open, it's a good refresher. We'll link to that blog on the show notes as well. Tim, let's shift to part 3. As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, I'm excited about this. We haven't really talked about this at length beyond the educational part of where does kids' college savings fit in the priority of investing? What are the options available? And part 3 here is all about how much is enough. Now, just like we talk about when it comes to saving for retirement, same question we got to answer here. And a shout out to you and the planning team. You've built a really cool resource and calculator that we use with our clients that we'll talk through at a high level here to really answer this question of, as I'm saving for my 4 boys, I'm not flying in the dark, hopefully, because we can put some assumptions in place and determine how much is enough based on those goals. And ultimately, am I on track? Am I not on track? And what should we be doing each and every month to get on track if that's the case of where we're headed? So it feels like, Tim, the first step in being able to answer this question of how much enough is to figure out what the goal is. What the goal is. Back to the poll question, right? We started the episode with is, what's the plan? Is it to cover all expenses? Is it a partial fund? Is it a no fund? Which I guess we could end the episode right there if that's the case. But if it's a partial or full fund, at what level, and we'll talk about the third rule here in a moment, at what level the funding is to be desired is an important assumption we have to make in these calculations, correct?
Yeah, I mean, and again, I think a lot of people, it probably is, I'm trying to think, of all the hundreds, if not thousands of meetings I've had with clients and prospective clients over, a lot of people are like, I don't know, I want to save something.
Yeah.
What is that? And there's a little bit of lack of like structure there. It's rare where people are, again, it's going to be on the tails there where it's like, I'm not worried about it all, or like, I want to do 100%. So I think in the absence of that structure, it's just a conversation of like, okay, like here's a framework. And that's what we talk about, the 1/3 rule. Here's a framework. Does that sound like, because the beauty of the 1/3 rule, or at least the way you think about it, is you're talking about what can I do today, but then you're also pushing it off to tomorrow because part of like your funding is going to come in like future earnings. But then also there is that skin in the game, which I love. I think having skin in the game with this decision to go to college is huge, or even like, giving money to your kids for college is huge, because we've seen how wasteful is probably not the correct term, but like how wasteful it can be when you're looking at schools out of state, private, when you're maybe jumping around in majors. I think having some type of realization that like, hey, you're going to be on the hook for some of this, and obviously pharmacists know this very well, is needed. At least that's the way that I look at it. So I think in the absence of any type of structure, I think introducing that 1/3 rule is important.
Let's talk about that rule, because
Yeah.
I think that if we use that as the baseline, you can adjust whatever you want, right? We'll talk about the three buckets and we're going to assume a third, a third, a third, but it could be 40%, 20%, 40%, right? So once you understand the concept, I think from there you could determine, hey, do I like that? Do I not like that? And what adjustments do you want to make? So walk us through what that third rule is.
So off the rip, a lot of clients be like, they look at like what their education costs, and they're like, no, like this is impossible. Like if I have a couple dollars, that can, rub together, that would be great. But when you kind of break it down, it's not as bad as it looks. So like the one third rule basically looks at, okay, when your child goes off to college, the sources of that of paying for college is going to really come from three places. A third of that, of that is going to come from, like we say, past income or past savings. So today in 2024, I'm saving out of my paycheck into my kids' 529, and it's going to grow.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the 529. It could be a Coverdale, it could be a Roth, whatever it looks like, but it's you're doing something today to spend in the future, just like we talk about with retirement savings. The other bucket, another third, comes from what I would say current income. And again, this would
Mm-hmm.
actually be future income. But like when Olivia is 18 and she's looking at colleges in 8 years, I'm hopefully still working at YFP. I'm making money, and I'm part of that tuition bill is going to come from the check that I'm receiving in 8 years. And then the last bucket and the last third would be that skin in the game. It would be that
Mm-hmm.
outside funding, where this is going to be grants, scholarships, and last but not least, loans. So this is where, and again, we talk about it with our kids that they're going to have some money, but we don't let them know what that is.
Mm-hmm.
My parents were like, "You're on your own," and then they helped us like later. It was kind of like a surprise. So we kind of talk about it, but they don't necessarily know what they're getting. But those are the three buckets. It's what you're saving and investing for future college expenses, and then when your kid is in college, using your part of your paycheck to pay for tuition, and then the last third coming from grant, scholarships, and student loans.
Tim, we've had several, I think at least a couple I can think of episodes we featured where pharmacists have really worked, throughout school, sometimes really aggressively to help pay down. Now, if you're working at 15, $20 an hour, you can only make such a dent in a couple $100,000 of debt. But that has been a significant contributor to minimizing the debt that they're having to borrow in any given semester. So in that case, when you think about a child working, would you put that in the final bucket, or how do you think of that portion?
I would put it in the final bucket. Again, I think it's kind of like their skin in the game. It's like, hey,
Yeah.
you could not be a great student and not get anything. Or, I know a lot of people, there's money to be out there for, we just gave out our first scholarship,
Yeah.
obviously on the back end for YFP Gives. But there's a lot of people that don't take that, go through that legwork. Olivia's goal is she wants to swim collegiately. That's her big thing right now. And she just missed her
Love it.
JO time yesterday by a couple of seconds. So she's doing well. And again, I think for her, I mean, I think my wife would love it if she got a scholarship for that. But I'm like, if it happens, great. If it doesn't, but to me, it's a little bit of their participation in this whole process, because
Mm-hmm.
it is a lot of money. When we look at the numbers, if we kind of go through this calculator, the numbers are staggering, right?
Yeah.
And like I just said, like when I was looking at it, as we were jumping on here, the 4-year in-state for Olivia went up. When I looked at it last month, and I
Mm-hmm.
guess they're just refreshing their numbers in the tool that I'm using. But these things go up, so I think having a plan in place is the way.
So with the third plan, or the third rule, is a framework of where we can get started. Obviously, everyone can adjust that accordingly. Talk us through then the calculation and how we ultimately get to this point of, hey, are we on track? Are we not on track? Or what do we need to be doing each month to get on track?
Yeah, so I'm using a combination of our financial planning tool called Right Capital and kind of a calculator I built. And part of it was because I wanted to kind of adapt it to the one third rule. So I rely on the calculator really for, or the financial planning tool really for like the inputs I just looked at. So in the tool, you can say, hey, I want to send my kid to a 2-year commuter, a 4-year in-state, a 4-year out-of-state, a 4-year private school, you can actually put in the school that you want, which again, I think is hard unless you're right up against it. So we put in a 4-year in-state. So like, hey, Ohio State's right down the street. That would be
Go
great.
Bucks.
You know, yeah. So essentially, like when I'm looking at Olivia's, so Olivia was born on Halloween of 2014. Today's the 15th of July, 2024. So her current age is 9.7. So she's almost a 10-year-old. I think she would say she is a 10-year-old. So we're saying that at 18, she's going to go to college. So what that leaves is essentially 8.3 years before she's got to move out and get out. And I can turn her bedroom into a man cave, which she doesn't like that joke.
Secondary whiskey storage unit.
Exactly. Yeah. So 8.3 years is our accumulation. That's what's left of our accumulation. So we make some assumptions about asset allocation. So in my calculator, I put in like an 80% equities, 20% in bonds. Right now, she's all equities. We have a lot of time. But as we get closer, we're going to be, to avoid sequence risk, we're going to be more conservative. So when we get to that 5-ish years, so maybe when she's 13, 14, 15, that's when we'll start to really kind of get more conservative until we have to spend it. So I'm using kind of a blended, she's not 100% equities the entire time. So I put 80-20, we use, so that real rate of return is about 4.6%. So that's kind of some of the, if I change that to 90-10 or 70-30, it would change the calculus. So the input that I was changing, that I was mentioning, when I looked at this last month, a 4-year in-state for her would be $183,653. So that's
with room and board.
Yes. So that's the need. So what that means is I think today it's something like $28,000. But when they extrapolate that out 8.3 years in the future, that's what it's going to cost, that $28,000 with the inflation times 4 years. So that's where we get the $183,000. So just as an example, my son, who is 5 years younger than Olivia, so Liam is 5. He'll be 5 next month already. His 4-year in-state will be $234,393. So it goes from 183.6 to 234.4. And then I don't have Zoe's calculated, but her 4-year in-state is 284.9. So $100,000 difference between my oldest and my youngest. There's essentially a 10-year gap for that between them. But that's significant. And that's why we're hoping some of this changes. But that's the number that I'm using, to kind of say, okay, this is what we need. So if I were to fully fund it, if I need to fully fund it, I would essentially need $183,000 in eight years. Or you could say 12 because I'm still, saving during that, but typically that's not how it works. So currently, today, Olivia has, I guess it's cool to share this, right, Tim?
Your plan.
Yeah. So currently Olivia has $28,629. So, and we put in, not quite the 4,000. We put in $300 a month or $3,600 per year. So we're on pace to save $103,000. So if you look at that, I need 183. We're on pace to save 103. So that our percentage now is we're on track to save 56% of her college. Now, that's not 100%, which is not our goal, but it's also a lot higher than the 33%. So there's some delta there. So, so I kind of break down, if we did want to pay 100%, what we would need if for us to be on pace to save for 100% to get to that 183, I would need $67,634 today. I don't have that. I have $28,000. If I lost all the monies in her 529 today, I would essentially need to be saving or investing $1,260 for the next 8.3 years to get to that 183,000. So because I have that, it's actually, I need to increase my savings from $300 a month to $854 per month to get to that. And obviously that's not something that we want to do. So And then I had the same thing broken down for the 1/3 rule. So 33% of 183,000 is 61,212. So again, when you break it down like that, I'm like, that's actually not that bad.
Yeah,
61,000, like that's doable. Now, the conversation I had with Shay when I ran this was, she's like, well, should we start saving less? And I'm like, essentially, like, the argument could be you could save less, or we could kind of stick to the status quo. My thought is like, that's one less bill that I have to worry about in 8.3 years. Like, it's
and
almost
she's
like
the oldest, so there's a
she's the
trickle down.
oldest. Correct.
Yeah.
So like, part of me is like, do I just get it to, and maybe we'll talk about this in the next iteration. So like, do I go to 67%, to get to my 2/3 of post and present income for that. And then she has her 1/3. So just to break down the math for 33%, I need 61,212. What you currently need today to be on pace would be, I would need 8,400 to be, and I have 28,000. So we're beating that. And then if I had $0, like if I lost all that money, I would just essentially need to be saving $420. So if you have a 10-year-old and you want to send them to a 4-year in-state and you haven't saved anything and you want to save at least 1/3, you would essentially need to be saving $420-ish per month between now and when they go. And then the last column is kind of the choose your own rule. So if I were to say, hey, Shay, like let's, we have some room in our budget, retirement looks good, et cetera. If I were to say, hey, let's go to that 67, that kind of checks off both for us. I would need 123,000. I would need today 38. We don't have 38,000. We have 28,000. So that lump sum to get us on track would be put 9,700, and I'm on track. Right. And then we would essentially be needing to invest $438. So I need to increase my monthly contribution by about $138. And then I go through the same thing with Liam. So Liam, just in broad strokes, not to go through every calculation, he has, so his what we need for him for a 4-year in-state 13 years from now, since he's 5, is 234,400 essentially. He has currently 13,800. We're currently putting in 225, so not as per month, so not as much as Olivia. And then we're on pace to save we'll call it 109,000. So we're 46% of the way there, or we're on track to be at 46, which is still being our 33% rule. So I look at this and we're in good shape. I think with Zoe, it's too early to tell because she only has a couple $100 in hers. But that's kind of the calculus that we're doing from, hey, are we on track or not from an education perspective? And again, like if the market loses 30% today, Tim, like right now it's been on a bull market, but if it loses 30% and all of a sudden he doesn't have 13.8, he has 10, that changes things. Right now, over the long period of time, we're still assuming, a nominal rate of return of 8.8%, which is an 80-20 portfolio. And then we adjust it down for inflation. So that's kind of the math. I know it's kind of hard to follow over the podcast, but hopefully that made sense as I was going through the numbers line by line.
Yeah, what I love about it is it makes kids' college savings much more practical
and palatable, earlier. Right? Like it's not like like you hear those headlines. It's just like your retirement. It's like, when I say to clients, it's like, hey, you need $2 million to retire. You're looking at me like I have 2 million heads because it's a big number way in the future. The same thing holds true with education. It's just, it feels more than what it actually is.
Yeah, it makes it digestible with the 3rd rule or some variation of that. I mean, really, it's a compressed nest egg calculation.
Yes.
Right. And that's what I love about it is we're not flying in the dark. What do we have saved right now? What's the goal? We're going to put some assumptions in place, just like we do with retirement planning. And then what do we need per month to achieve that goal? And that last part is the piece that is so often missing when we talk about long-term savings and investing, right? Whether it's 10 years or 30 years, some of these numbers, as you mentioned, feel big, they feel overwhelming, they feel scary. And what we can relate to and put our arms around is what do we need to be doing per month? Or what is the goal? And then we can look at the rest of the plan, the budget, all those things and figure out, can we make this happen or can we not make it happen? And then what does that mean in terms of what they have saved? What does that mean for other financial goals? So yeah, I think if we think about it in that sense, we really can start to implement this and put a game plan in place and make some adjustments if need be. And context matters, right? So I would think how you think about this for Olivia versus your youngest, Zoe, is very different, right? When you get to the potential for over saving, With Olivia, well, that's different with your first and your third, right?
Correct.
Because you have an option to transfer. So I think a lot of details to be considered as we look at the individual components of how you approach the 529.
Yeah, and I've really enjoyed, I've been trying to get Olivia kind of more interested in like money and the value of money. And, she told me the other day, she's like, when I go back to school, can I buy these like $100 like Nike shoes? And I'm like, no, you can't. Like, let's like, we'll spend some money and then you can save some of your money and there'll be a cap on what you can do. And even my wife said like, oh, like if she gets money, should we put that in her 529? I'm like, I actually like when she does her allowance, I say like, hey, any money that you want to put into your UPMA account, like I'll match it. Mm-hmm. So, and I did the same thing. Like she's gonna donate to YFP Gives, and I'll match that, right? Because I want to incentivize that behavior, but I kind of want the 529 to be like funded by me and mom, right? So like I don't want her spend money to go to the 529. So I'd rather have that money go into an UPMA that she can use it. She could use it for school, or she could use it for a car, a business, a gap year, or whatever. But I've enjoyed kind of like having some of those conversations with her and kind of seeing some of the lights go on in terms of like investments and that's the thing. Like I've always struggled with like, should I kind of key them into like what we're doing on the 529, or should it be more of like a mystery? Because I really don't want her to like say like, oh, like mom and dad have it paid for. Like I don't need to work. My mom took the opposite route. She's like, you have to work because we're not going to help you at all. Mm-hmm. But I think these types of discussions with your kid, even when they're young, like mine are, is positive. Yep. And again, like I grew up, we didn't really talk about too much about money, like outside of like you're on your own. But I think building some of those behaviors and kind of mindset around money is important, because a lot of people that come through the door to work with us, they're kind of an image of their parents, right? A lot of them is like, if they had consumer debt issues, it's probably because their parents did. If they were oversavers, probably because their parents were. Some people look at the parents and say, I don't want to be like that, and they're trying to fix it. But like the natural inclination is to spend or save. So I think it's a good opportunity to at least start the conversation around money with kids.
Great stuff, Tim. And that's a topic we're going to talk more about on the show. One, because we haven't talked about it enough. And two, we're living it firsthand with our own kids.
Yep,
so we're excited to share that journey as well. Let me wrap up by saying, for those that are listening, yes, talking about kids' college, but also other parts of the financial plan, saving, investing for the future, retirement planning, tax planning, debt pay down, and so forth. We've got a team of certified financial planners and Sean Richards, our CPA and tax professional, that can help you in working one-on-one as it relates to your own financial plan. If you're interested in learning more about the services, you can visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com. From there, you can book a discovery call with Tim to learn more about the services and determine whether or not they're the right fit. Thanks so much for listening. If you like what you've heard on this episode, other episodes of the podcast, please do us a favor, leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the shows. Have a great rest of your week. Before we wrap up today's show, I want to again thank this week's sponsor of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast, First Horizon. We're glad to have found a solution for pharmacists that are unable to save 20% for a down payment on a home. A lot of pharmacists and the YFP community have taken advantage of First Horizon's Pharmacist Home Loan, which requires a 3% down payment for a single-family home or townhome for first-time home buyers and has no PMI on a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. To learn more about the requirements for First Horizon's Pharmacist Home Loan and to get started with the pre-approval process, you can visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home-loan. Again, that's yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home-loan. As we conclude this week's podcast, an important reminder that the content on this show is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding material should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on the podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist unless otherwise noted and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you again for your support of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Have a great rest of your week.